Mel Gibson knew he was too old for the role, knew the history was wrong, and made the film anyway. What he didn't know was that it would change a country's politics, and that the title had nothing to do with the man on the poster. Fact one, Gibson didn't want to direct.
It's just a funny corner of history that I'd never heard of before. And the script was a very haunting piece of work.
Mel Gibson was sent screenplay for Braveheart by producer Alan Ladd Jr., who had picked it up from first-time screenwriter Randall Wallace. Gibson's initial response was to star in the film, but let someone else direct it. He approached several directors and received no enthusiasm. The project was losing momentum. Gibson eventually concluded that no director he trusted would take it on with the same intensity he felt the material demanded, and he made the decision to direct it himself. He later admitted he always believed he was at least a decade too old to play Wallace convincingly, and said so on the record in a 2009 interview with the Daily Mail. The man who won the Best Director Oscar for Braveheart spent the early stages of production trying to give the job to someone else. Fact 2. The title is wrong. The word Braveheart does not refer to William Wallace. It never did. The term is historically associated with Robert the Bruce, the Scottish king whose story runs parallel to Wallace's in the film. According to the 14th century chronicler John Barber, when Robert the Bruce died, he asked his knight Sir James Douglas to carry his heart on a crusade to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. During a battle in Spain, Douglas is reported to have thrown the casket containing the heart into the fray and cried, "Lead on, brave heart, I will follow thee." The heart was later recovered and buried at Melrose Abbey. The film gives the title to Wallace, who has no connection to it whatsoever. Gibson has acknowledged the inaccuracy and said it was simply a good title for the story he was telling. Fact 3. Based on a poem. Randall Wallace, the screenwriter, based his script primarily on an epic poem written by a 15th century bard known as Blind Harry. The poem was written approximately 170 years after Wallace's death in 1305 and is openly romantic rather than historical in character. Blind Harry claimed to be drawing on earlier written sources, but no corroborating evidence for those sources has ever been found. Wallace's script is therefore based on a romanticized poem written more than a century and a half after the events it describes, which was itself of uncertain factual basis. Both Gibson and Wallace publicly described the film as history when it was released. Fact 4. Patric was first choice. According to screenwriter Randall Wallace, Brad Pitt, who was frequently cited in press coverage as a near miss for the role of William Wallace, was never seriously considered. The actor Gibson genuinely wanted in the lead was Jason Patric, who had broken through in the 1991 film Rush. Patric did not take the role. Gibson then decided to play the part himself, despite his private reservations about his age. At the time of filming, Gibson was 38 years old. The character of William Wallace was supposed to be in his mid-20s for the first half of the film. Gibson acknowledged this gap directly and repeatedly throughout production and in subsequent interviews. Fact 5. Scotland was mostly Ireland. The majority of Braveheart was not filmed in Scotland. The large-scale battle sequences, including the Battle of Stirling Bridge and the Battle of Falkirk, were filmed on the Curragh Plain in County Kildare, Ireland. Between 1,600 and 2,000 extras were recruited, most of them members of the Forza Cosanta Ite the reserve branch of the Irish Army. Gibson did film some sequences in Scotland itself, including locations around Loch Leven and Glencoe, and the set for Wallace's village was built in the Glen Nevis Valley. But the epic military confrontations that define the film's visual identity were staged on Irish soil using Irish soldiers. After the production wrapped, the car park the filmmakers built on location in Scotland remained. It is still referred to locally as the Braveheart Car Park. Fact 6. Kilts 5 centuries wrong. The most immediately recognizable visual element of Braveheart Wallace and his men in belted plaid tartans is historically impossible. Kilts of any kind were not worn in Scotland in the 13th century. Historian Sharon Crosa has stated categorically that no Scots wore belted plaids during Wallace's lifetime, and that even when kilts did eventually appear in the 16th century, they were not worn in the style depicted in the film. Scottish author Peter Triquare described the costume choices as a farcical representation, noting that Wallace was portrayed as a wild and hairy Highlander painted with woad 1,000 years too late, running amok in a tartan kilt 500 years too early. The clan tartan system itself is a Victorian invention created centuries after Wallace's death. Fact 7. Paint a millennium wrong. The blue face paint worn by Gibson and the Scottish warriors in the film is associated with the Picts, ancient Celtic people who used woad dye in rituals and possibly in battle. The Pictish tradition of body painting dates to approximately the 1st century BC and had effectively disappeared from Scotland long before the 13th century. Wallace and his men at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297 would have worn no such paint. The imagery of the blue-faced Scottish warrior is now so culturally embedded that many people believe it to be historically authentic. It is not. It belongs to a tradition that predates Wallace by roughly 1,000 years. Gibson has acknowledged this in interviews, stating that he was aware of the inaccuracies but prioritized dramatic effect. Fact 8. The Irish soldiers fought each other. The reserve Irish Army soldiers recruited as extras for the battle scenes were organized into companies, and those companies typically came from the same geographic areas of Ireland. Regional rivalries between units were common and well known within the reserve forces. According to multiple accounts from the production, several of the battle sequences became considerably more authentic than planned when rival companies used the chaos of filming as an opportunity to settle old scores. Gibson later remarked on the DVD commentary that the fighting in some scenes was far more realistic than intended. Nobody was seriously hurt, but the level of genuine aggression between certain groups of extras gave the battle footage an energy that professionally choreographed stunt work would have been unlikely to generate. If you're enjoying this hit, subscribe. Most of you watching right now aren't subscribed, and that's the one thing that tells YouTube to show you the next video. One tap. That's all it takes. Fact 9. No bridge at Stirling. The Battle of Stirling Bridge, fought on 11 September 1297, is one of the most tactically significant victories in Scottish military history. The bridge was not incidental to the battle, it was the entire point. Wallace and his co-commander Andrew de Moray allowed the English forces to begin crossing the narrow bridge over the River Forth before attacking, trapping half the English army on the Scottish side and cutting them off from retreat. The bridge was the weapon. Braveheart's depiction of Stirling features no bridge. The battle is fought in an open field. Irish historian Cian Duffy has noted with characteristic understatement that the Battle of Stirling Bridge could have done with a bridge. Gibson has said the bridge was removed because it would have been boring cinematically. The most decisive tactical element of Scotland's most famous victory was left out because the director found it dull. Fact 10. Isabella was a child. The film presents a romantic and ultimately sexual relationship between William Wallace and Isabella of France, the wife of the future Edward II. Sophie Marceau, who played Isabella, was 28 years old during filming. The historical Isabella was born around 1295. Wallace was executed in August 1305, at which point Isabella was approximately 10 years old and living in France. She did not marry Edward II until 1308, 3 years after Wallace's death, when she was about 12 or 13. She could not have met Wallace, let alone had an affair with him. The film goes further and implies that Isabella is pregnant with Wallace's child as Wallace is being executed, a suggestion that the future Edward III was fathered by Wallace. Edward III was born in 1312, 7 years after Wallace's death. Fact 11. Edward died 2 years later. Braveheart ends with King Edward I Longshanks dying on his deathbed at the moment. Wallace is being executed, a dramatic device that presents the king's death as a kind of cosmic punishment. Edward I did not die at the time of Wallace's execution. Wallace was executed on 23 August 1305. Edward I died on 7 July 1307, nearly 2 years later, while leading another military campaign against Scotland. He died not in his bed, but in the field, on the march northward, still pursuing the war against Scottish independence. The poetic justice of the film's ending has no basis in history. Edward outlived Wallace by almost 2 years and was still fighting the Scots when he died. Fact 12. Wallace was not a peasant. The film presents William Wallace as a man of humble origins, a farmer's son, a commoner, an outsider to the nobility he challenges. The historical Wallace was from the minor Scottish nobility. His father Malcolm was a knight. Wallace himself would have received an education appropriate to his standing and trained in arms from an early age. He was from Elderslie in Renfrewshire in the Lowlands, not the Highlands, and was of Anglo-Norman descent. The romantic image of Wallace as a barefoot peasant leading a peasant uprising is a narrative construction, most of it traceable to Blind Harry's poem. The real Wallace was a trained soldier from a knightly family who happened to lead one of the most effective military campaigns in medieval Scottish history. Fact 13. Scotland hated the statue. In 1997, a 13-foot sandstone sculpture of Mel Gibson as William Wallace was placed in the car park at the foot of the Wallace Monument in Stirling. The monument itself commemorates the real Wallace. The statue was based on Gibson's appearance in the film, complete with blue face paint and braided hair. It was almost immediately defaced. Visitors and locals repeatedly vandalized the figure, attaching a traffic cone to its head and coating it in paint. The local tourism board eventually surrounded it with a cage, which made the situation significantly worse. The caged Gibson Wallace became one of the most photographed pieces of public mockery in Scotland. In 2008, the statue was quietly removed and returned to its sculptor to make room for a new visitor center. It has been described as among the most loathed pieces of public art Scotland has ever produced. Fact 14. The film influenced a referendum. Braveheart is widely credited with playing a measurable role in the growth of Scottish nationalism and the push for independence. The film was released in 1995, and the Scottish devolution referendum, in which Scotland voted to establish its own parliament, took place in September 1997. Screenwriter Randall Wallace has said that every time Scotland discusses leaving the United Kingdom, he is asked how he feels about it, and always replies that he is an American and did not intend the film as a political statement. The Scottish National Party used imagery and rhetoric associated with the film in its campaigning materials during subsequent independence debates. A Hollywood film made by an American director starring an Australian-raised actor about a 13th century Scottish knight became a touchstone of 21st century Scottish political identity. Fact 15. Gibson nearly died on set. During production of a battle sequence, Gibson fell from his horse. As he lay on the ground, the horse, startled by the fall, reared up above him. In the moment before the horse came down, Gibson's stunt double rushed in and pulled him clear. Gibson later stated that he was within a fraction of a second of being crushed. He also described the production's approach to safety as rigorous, noting that despite the scale and violence of the battle sequences, the cast and crew sustained relatively minor injuries, primarily sprained ankles and broken noses. He was dismissive of reports that appeared during production claiming hundreds of people had been hospitalized, attributing those stories to unnamed detractors. Fact 16. Nobody predicted the Oscars. When Braveheart was released in May 1995, the award season conversation was dominated by Apollo 13, Sense and Sensibility, Leaving Las Vegas, Il Postino, and The Usual Suspects. Braveheart was not regarded as a serious Oscar contender by most industry observers. The film's position changed after it won the Golden Globe Award for Best Director at the 53rd Golden Globe Awards in January 1996. That win shifted perception, and Braveheart went on to receive 10 Academy Award nominations. It won 5: Best Picture, Best Director for Gibson, Best Cinematography, Best Sound Effects Editing, and Best Makeup. It became only the 9th film in history to win Best Picture without receiving a single acting nomination, a distinction that has since been achieved by only 3 other films. Fact 17. The score was rushed. Composer James Horner, who had previously worked with Gibson on The Man Without a Face, was given relatively little time to complete the Braveheart score. He drew on Scottish and Irish folk music traditions and used instruments including tin whistle, Julian pipes, and bodhran to create a sound rooted in the landscape of the film. The score was performed by the London Symphony Orchestra. It received an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Score, a Golden Globe nomination, and a BAFTA nomination. It has since become one of the most commercially successful film soundtracks of the 1990s and is regularly cited as one of Horner's finest works. It was his second of 3 collaborations with Gibson as director. Fact 18. The 4-hour cut exists. The theatrical release of Braveheart runs approximately 2 hours and 57 minutes. Gibson has stated in multiple interviews that he assembled a 4-hour cut of the film during editing and that he considers it a legitimate version of the story. He has said he would release it if Paramount provided the funding for the restoration and presentation. Randall Wallace has described the theatrical cut as the most effective version dramatically, but acknowledged he would want audiences to see the longer cut for what it contains. Among the material cut from the theatrical release were 3 dream sequences written by Wallace, in which Wallace is visited by the ghost of his murdered wife, Murrin. Wallace has said Murrin dies so early in the story that the dream sequences were intended to keep her emotional presence alive throughout the film. They were filmed but did not survive the edit. Fact 19. Empire voted it both best and worst. In the same British film magazine, Braveheart holds a distinction that no other Best Picture winner can claim. Empire readers voted it the best film of 1,995. Then, in a 2005 poll conducted by the same magazine, Empire readers voted it number 1 on their list of the 10 worst films ever to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. The same audience, the same publication, 10 years apart, producing diametrically opposite verdicts on the same film. The tension between those 2 responses captures something genuine about Braveheart's place in cinema history. It is a film that people love despite knowing it is wrong, and resent despite knowing they love it. No other film in the modern era occupies that specific cultural position quite so completely. Fact 20. Reality was far worse. The execution depicted in Braveheart is savage and prolonged, and Gibson clearly intended it to be the film's most harrowing sequence. The historical execution of William Wallace on 23 August 1305 was worse. Wallace was hanged but cut down while still alive, then disemboweled, his organs burned in front of him, then beheaded and quartered, his body divided into 4 parts and sent to different cities as a warning. His head was placed on a spike on London Bridge. His right arm was sent to Newcastle, his left arm to Berwick, his right leg to Perth, and his left leg to Aberdeen or Stirling, depending on the source. Gibson showed the beginning of this process and then cut away. What the film depicts as its most extreme moment is a restrained version of what actually happened to the man whose story it is telling.